On Zoom and also our guest here. Hi, my name is Kavindya. I'm actually a cognitive psychology PhD student, but I did my undergraduate degree in computer science at Princeton. And so after I graduated from Princeton, I started working at a developmental psych lab at Columbia. I did that for 2 years. And today, as a member of the Socrates program, I'm actually going to hopefully be able to convince my audience about the importance of robotic learning. And I'm going to spend, I want to say, like the most important parts of my presentation are going to be the first 2 points where I talk about well, first I'm going to argue that actually babies are probably doing better than state-of-the-art learning strategies and algorithms. And then I'm going to talk to you guys about why it's actually very non-trivial to understand what baby learning strategies are. And then finally, I'm going to go over a study where we actually looked at infant attention and what that can tell us about infant learning that I did when I was at Columbia. And so that was a study where we wanted to see how infant attention related to something called environmental affordances. So that's just like variation in the environment that babies grow up in. So how do they like pay attention to all the different types of information that's available to them? And then like, are there types of information that they prefer to access versus others? So for that study, I want to say that the bulk of the most important part of that like case study is going to be our data collection, because I'm assuming that most people here have a background in engineering or computer science. And so from my experience, the way data gets annotated and collected in psychology, the standards for that are actually extremely different than they are in engineering. And so I'm hoping that that will give people some insight and maybe inspiration into how like when it comes to understanding how people and babies learn or making any sort of inference about their behaviors or their cognition, we have to be really careful about the way we conduct our analyses. And so that's going to be data collection. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what our actual quantitative measure was in that study. So how we use information content. And then finally, I'm going to actually show you guys the results from that study. Um, So there's only 3 people in this room, but I just want to I want to see like show of hands, like who here believes the title of this slide like from the beginning. So like if I were to tell you that I think that babies are better learners than any state-of-the-art like neural network or like robot training algorithm, like who would agree with me? No? Okay, yeah, so we have 2-1 over here. Is anyone in chat like who has a strong opinion about this? You can like raise your hand, say yes or no. Or you could just say what your opinion is. Raquel agrees with me. Okay, and I think Ted agrees with me, which is awesome. I'm gonna assume that Aditya doesn't. Okay, so this is unexpected. I thought there'd be more engineers in here who'd be like, no, there's no way that a baby's better. I'm glad we have one at least. Okay, so what I want to start my argument with is the fact that for a lot of tasks, the same tasks that robots and neural networks struggle with, like babies, like just their existence and the fact that they can turn into adults proves that there are efficiently learnable solutions to those problems. So what I mean by that is when babies learn, they do it, number one, in an unsupervised manner. So you can tell babies like what labels are for certain things. You could tell them, oh, this is how you grasp a cup, or this is how you turn an object, or this is what this word means, this is what this is called. But obviously, like if you're like talking to a newborn, they don't know what any of those gestures or what those words mean. So the way they're learning from their environment is completely unsupervised. They have to discover the labels that we give to machine learning models, or that we give to like learning algorithms for robots. And then the second like example I want to give of this is when babies are first born, they actually have really, really, really bad eyesight. So they can only see like really blurry objects, and they are like at the most they can do like edge detection. So like borders in the visual field that are like very contrastive, either because of the colors or because of like the light and darkness. those are the things that babies are looking at, and like all the finer details are like super hard for them to pick up on. But despite that, they actually learn at that level of visual precision into higher levels of visual precision, and eventually they're able to do like what we rely on, like what, Sam does, where we can like recognize images, where like you can recognize images, you can like label parts of the images, etc. But again, like if you think about the models that we use in engineering, first off, the resolution of the images that we use in training is very, very high. And second off, the quality of the labels is also very, very high, right? Like we tend to be like, this is what this object is, this is what that object is, and we give them many views of the same object, or we'll give them many different types of objects. And so the amount of information that neural networks or like artificial agents have is actually way more than what babies are working with. And also the resolution of the features that we provide to those artificial agents is much higher than the resolution that babies are working with, and yet they still get it done. And so that's why I really bolded here in this slide the fact that babies are proof that there are efficiently learnable solutions. And so what I have at the bottom right is a screenshot of this article, Modern Language Models Refute Chomsky's Approach to Language. And this author, Piantadosi, he's actually a very, you know him? Oh, oh, right, right, right. Okay, yeah, we have a Chomsky head in here. So Piantadosi is actually he's a very prolific developmental psychologist. So like for him to say this is like not crazy, but it was like it was a stir. Like there was like drama. There was a little bit of drama in I think the field when he released this. And so the really important thing that he says here that's relevant to my presentation, he sort of talks about in the end, most notably the bottom of the abstract, large language models have attained remarkable success at discovering grammar without using any of the methods that some in linguistics insisted were necessary for a science of language to progress. And so in this so Piantadosi's take here was basically that ChatGPT, all it's really doing is predicting the next token in like a sequence of words, that represent an utterance. Just by doing that, somehow ChatGPT is able to like reach a level of language production that can fool a human being. And so that's evidence that like all you need really is just the statistics of language. You just need the token representations, and then that's sufficient. You don't need any of the stuff that like maybe Chomsky thinks is necessary. So like some sort of innate language model. And so disclaimer, like I'm actually not a very pro innate stuff person. But I don't necessarily agree with Piantadosi's take that large language models are evidence that Chomsky is wrong. And the reason for this is the thing that this sort of doesn't highlight is that large language models have attained this level of success by training on like billions and billions of tokens. The amount of data that any of the foundation models that we have right now, like any of the popular ChatGPT, all those models have been trained on way more data than an infant, the average infant, the average adult experienced in their childhood during their language acquisition phase. And so all these models have told us is that if you have a large amount of this data, you can acquire language from it. But what babies show us is that like you can cut the amount of data, this amount of training data exponentially, and somehow using some other strategy beyond just like this token prediction maybe, you can acquire language. And so the fact that babies require far less training data to do things like acquire language, and the fact that they receive far less variation in the training data. So like if you think about, ChatGPT, you're like scraping the internet, the entire internet for like data. So you're getting how many different people's language production. But babies usually, the first like people that they hear are like their caregivers, their neighbors maybe. And it's always like the same people around them because they have pretty stable environments, right? Like, where they live and like the people that they encounter tends to be the same group, tends to be the same environment. And so it's not as the training data that they have access to is actually not as diverse and maybe information rich as what we give our artificial agents. And despite all of that, you get adults that can like talk, that can like understand language, and actually are the standard for those artificial agents. Okay, has this changed? We have one person here who disagreed. Not yet. Okay, fair enough. And so again, I do want to like emphasize though that when I say like versus state of the art, right? Um, I'm like weighting the amount of data that you need and the amount of computing power that you need. I'm like penalizing sort of state of the art models for the amount that they use. So if you're imposing that kind of like penalization for like how efficient you are, I think that it is a bit hard to argue that babies don't win. But you could argue that like the models that I'm talking about, their performance ends up being better than like the average human's performance on those tasks, regardless. Okay. The second thing that I wanted to drive home is that infant learning and like understanding infant learning is actually a very non-trivial problem. And so what I mean by that is just anecdotally, I have a colleague here well, actually, I have a colleague in the Zoom right now who is working on a study where he's like collecting fixation data from like humans. So he's like gonna see like what do people look at when they're like navigating campus. And one of the main problems that they ran into in like planning their analysis is that you can imagine the amount of fixation data that they're gonna get is gonna be crazy large, right? Because they have like a very high frame rate like recorder, and they're gonna be like recording for a long period of time, they're going to be going through a long path on campus. They're going to get so much data. What do they do with it? And so one thing that I've heard them suggest is just let's scrap the data that is like corresponds to parts of the path that are just like visually very non-rich. So like, if you're looking at a flat plane or something, or just like a field. So that you would think, right? Like you can make this assumption if you're an engineer or if you're any sort of researcher, that it's fine to remove that data because it's like redundant and there probably isn't much that it's going to tell us about human navigation. And the reason why I say that this is sort of, even though this is maybe a natural assumption to make, this is not the kind of assumption that a psychologist would make. And that's simply because we can't just assume based on what we as adults are aware of, what we perceive, what we've already learned, that babies are doing the same sort of information filtering that we would do. And so what I have here is this point that when we talk about infant attention, it's not just like they look at everything and they take all of that into account. It's actually a very smart mechanism. And so they're able to filter information, the large amounts of sensory information that they get, very effectively. And we know this because, again, like I said, they get way less data than we give to artificial agents, and they have way less training time, let's say. It doesn't really take that long for a baby to learn language, to me, in my opinion. And so what that tells us is that they're, for them to be able to handle those large amounts of data, they must be efficiently filtering it. Um, Basically extracting only what they need for those specific tasks that we struggle in engineering with designing agents that can actually accomplish those tasks or like learn to accomplish those tasks. And so I have a few papers here talking about, I think a really good one is the cascading development of visual attention in infancy, learning to look and looking to learn. So this is by a developmental psychologist. It was published in 2023, but I think the research is a little bit older. And it's a really great review about studies that have gone into like what do babies look at, and one of the key points that it reveals is that it's not that babies are born knowing how to filter information. The way they filter visual information, which we see reflected in the way they look at things, it changes over time. And so they actually learn to look at things that are more informative, let's say. That's what we're assuming. We're assuming that that's why their looking patterns change. Things that are more informative, basically, for whatever their brain is doing behind the scenes. So like we don't actually know what task it's optimizing, but we do know that the information that it's giving to learn that task changes over time, over the course of their development. And so this is why I say that infant learning is non-trivial. And this is something that like is connected to, again, infancy, right? So this like attention module is something that is being shaped throughout development. And by the time you're an adult, you can maybe make the assumption that your attention module is very different than what your attention module was as a child. And so another paper here that I think people might find interesting is the sensitivity to well, the emergence of multisensory systems through perceptual narrowing. So this is another review paper. So it's going to go through a few examples of like how developmentally babies actually start out with finer senses than like adults. So I think the auditory domain is a good example of this. Babies actually have better frequency, like pitch discrimination than adults. And like by the time they learn their native language, they lose a lot of their sensitivity and their ability to discriminate between sounds because they've reduced their sensitivity to only the sounds that matter in their language. And so that's sort of like a big thing that they start out, they do a perceptual narrowing. So they actually start out better at discriminating more, but then perhaps for efficiency's sake, they end up optimizing so that they only retain some of that precision. Um, and so going back to that idea that like, oh, they get so much sensory information, how do we know like what's actually relevant? We want to know like what do the infant brains actually pay attention to? So we don't want to make the assumptions about like what information they're filtering. We don't want to say like, oh, this is redundant, so they probably don't look at it. In order to really be able to say that, you need to experimentally verify that it's true. And that's what the bulk of the research in psychology is dedicated to doing. And I think that's often why, like, you know, my engineering peers will be like, well, you could just make the study more complex. Like, why don't you just make it, why is it so simple? Well, the reason is because it's more difficult to say, oh, this is what the babies are paying attention to, or this is what the human brain is paying attention to if you have too many confounding features. Okay, so this actually brings me to the case study that I'm going to be going over. And so this is a study that I worked on when I was at Columbia, and you'll see that there's like a billion names on here, and that is for a reason. The title of this study, or like the general idea of the study, was the question that we were asking was, how do infants allocate attention to their caregivers during naturalistic interactions? The reason why there are so many names on this is because it was like paid for by this ginormous grant, the LEAP grant, that actually sponsors researchers across the world to collect data from like various areas geographically. And they collect very large data sets and they train the researchers in those areas as well to collect those data sets. And so these names are just some of the people who like were involved with collecting the data. Some of these people annotated the data, and then some of these people analyzed the data. So that's why there's so many names. Okay. And so just some background that you need to know about this study, like theoretically, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is not really a psych presentation. What we were interested in this study was we wanted to see how the affordances in an infant's environment, so the things that an infant has access to, the things that they can learn from, how does like changing and varying those affordances relate to their caregivers' behaviors, right? Because, you know, babies are taken care of by people. You don't just put a baby in an environment, right? Like there's sort of an intermediate figure there that is also being affected by the baby and by the environment. The environment's affordances, that's a caregiver. So how do affordances link to caregiver unpredictability? And then how do the caregiver's behavior and the unpredictability of their behaviors link back to the infant's attention? And so again, this is sort of like we have three variables here, really. So the environment's going to affect the infants, it's going to affect the caregivers, and then the caregivers are going to also affect the infants. And so the babies really have to think about, well, you could assume that their brains really have to figure out, what should I look at given all this information? And so we wanted to know, first off, do the caregivers themselves seem to be sensitive to like what's available in their environments? And number two, we want to know, based on how the caregivers vary their behavior, do infants also like change their attention patterns? Do they change their looking patterns? And so that second question, I think, is something that if you're like a roboticist, you might be interested in, because if you can understand how infants allocate attention, if you know what features or what information they're extracting, that might be information that you want to pass on to an artificial agent, because you know that this is what babies use to effectively learn. And so maybe instead of just giving a robot all this information that we have, we can just give it these parts that we know are helpful to accomplish this task. Okay. And so this second question is in fact the major one. Do infants allocate attention accordingly? If we find that the answer is yes, this is a really like amazing finding, because it literally means that babies are actually like tracking, they're somehow sensitive to the structure of their environment, how like unpredictable, how learnable their environment is in a naturalistic context. So when I say naturalistic context, I'm gonna get to that again when we get to the data collection. But a naturalistic context is also big in psychology because historically you do studies in like the lab, and in the lab you can't really vary a lot of stuff. You just have like simple, you'll just show people a study on a screen, or you'll have like a room with like a limited number of toys, and you'll see like how do people interact. Or maybe you'll just have the researcher be the one who interacts with the baby, which is actually not very reflective of like in the real life how the baby is learning. In real life, when the baby learns, they're at home. They have all the toys that they have access to at home, and the people that are interacting with them are their caregivers. And so there's been sort of a push in this past decade for psych studies to be more dedicated to making their experiments naturalistic. Okay. And so how do we do that in this study? So again, this is why there's so many names, and this is why the grant was so ginormous. The subjects that we had were 3-month-old infants and their primary caregivers. There were 222 of them, and they were all from South Africa and Malawi. And so the data that we collected was actually like video recordings of play sessions between the infants and their caregivers while they were like in South Africa and Malawi, respectively. And so we have like the audio data, we have like multiple camera angles. And then we also split the play sessions into 2 halves. So in the first half of the play session, we provided the dyads, the infant caregiver pairs, with toys that were culturally appropriate, and they were like ones that they might have had at home as well. In the second half of the study, we didn't have the toys. So like a researcher came in and either removed them, or like sometimes we had the order switched and they would have no toys at first and then they'd have toys. So it's balanced. And so the reason why we did this manipulation with the toys and the no toys is because this allows us to say that between the 2 conditions, the toy and no toy halves, the environmental affordances are different. So in one of the conditions you have toys, and in one of the conditions you don't have toys. Seems like a very like, trivial, like very simple delineation to make, but it is like, if you think about it, a natural one, right? Sometimes when you're interacting with a baby, you might have toys nearby and sometimes you might not. So if you're a caregiver, your behavior, we have reason to believe, is going to differ between those 2 conditions. Okay. And now, again, this is one of the things that I said is also I think is super important if you're an engineer. How did we actually like quantify the data? So these were videos that were, remember, 222. We had 222 pairs, and we had a video for each of those pairs. This was hand annotated. So we had like research assistants, and we had like researchers, like people with PhDs or people who are getting their PhDs, literally learn how to consistently, so consistent across all of the people coding, mark frames as being examples of these specific caregiver behaviors that you see. So vocalizing, so just like making some sort of sound that's like speech, holding objects, touching infants, holding the infant, or pointing, which is like, an attention-getting thing. So each of these frames, 5 minutes per condition, so 5 minutes with toys, 5 minutes without toys, we would literally annotate the time intervals and say like, oh, in this frame, the caregiver is vocalizing. In this set of frames, the caregiver is vocalizing. In this set of frames, the baby is looking. So this is sort of just gaze direction. It's not actually like precise vision, but it is like they're looking at their caregiver during those times. And so when I say that we made sure that everyone like annotated the same way, this means that like there was a very rigorous training protocol for the RAs. So I know that some of my like colleagues, like when they talk about their engineering research, they like will also hand annotate, but they don't necessarily do any sort of like sanity check to make sure that everyone is annotating the same way or to the same standards. So there is, of course, going to be subjectivity in your judgments when you're annotating. So someone might be like, okay, the pointing actually ends on this frame. Or someone might be like, this person is clearly touching the infant. And then someone else might be like, no, they're actually holding the infant. And so how do you make sure that everyone is coding in the same way? Well, what you do is you enforce training sessions where some of the videos are not actually going to be used for the data, and they're just going to be used as training videos for the coders in training. And you demonstrate how to code those frames. You have someone who's already an expert coder, and then you teach other people to code, and then you don't let those people progress to actually being like non-trainee coders until their annotations are until their annotations match up to a certain percentage the fully trained coders annotations. So you guys have any questions about that? That might sound a little confusing.
Because sometimes they also like have multiple coders code the same thing.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Himali. So Himali brought up an inter-rater reliability score and how sometimes like you'll have multiple people coding the same video. So that might seem like very redundant. Like, why are you having someone code the same data point a bunch of times? But what that actually lets you do is, again, it's like sort of sanity checking while you're still annotating the data. Are people maintaining a rate of correspondence that's like sufficiently high? And actually in psychology, whenever you like report these things, like whenever you have hand annotation, you have to report the inter-rater reliability score. If you don't report it, you're almost definitely not going to be published. So you have to report that score, and you also have to report the training procedure that you used and like what your standards for agreement were. And so it's like a very, very rigorous in terms of like you have to make sure that everyone is like on the same page about what they're coding and how they're coding. And again, it takes a lot of labor. So this took like over a year, I want to say. And we had, again, like teams of coders that were like, some of them were graduate students and some of them were like RAs. Okay. So just to give you an example of what the coding looks like, again, I said that we had multiple camera angles. And so if you're on the Zoom, can you see my cursor? Oh, no, you cannot. Let me figure out how to add that. Okay. Laser pointer. Okay. I think you guys can see my cursor now. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so you'll see here, like there's 3 videos in this. So you could see each of these are all frames from different angles, but they're all at the same time. So at like whatever timestamp this person paused it on, this is like the 3 views that they have. And so like you can imagine if you only had this view, you don't really know what the mom's like left arm is doing, right? So you don't know. They could be touching the infant, they could be pointing, whatever. And so that's why we have these additional camera views. So you see like, okay, so this person is actually holding an object in front of their child. And then this like interface that you're seeing, it's the data view interface. That's like a free software that gets used in a lot of psychology studies for annotating videos. Because again, what you're doing is you're annotating frame by frame. You'll have like different categories of behaviors or like whatever categories you're using, and you can like literally mark in overlapping ways, like what's going on at this timestamp, what's going on in this time frame, etc. And then you can like output that into like a little CSV file that makes it really easy to analyze quantitatively. And this is a video that plays. So what you saw there was that like the green is literally like the interface is showing you like as you watch the video, these are the cell blocks. These are the blocks that correspond to what's happening in those frames. So I think it's a very nice interface, and it's like again, it's free, like it's like open source. People just made it for psych researchers just made it for psych researchers to use. I don't know any other fields that use it. Raquel has a question, and I have a feeling that it's going to answer my question. Go ahead.
I have two small questions. Well, one is why Malawi and what was it, South Africa? And the other one is how do you how do you choose when to record? And my question is more like how do you ensure it was not biased, the interaction? Like if they were aware that they were being recorded, they would probably act differently, or was not wouldn't that bias the study? I don't know.
It is a good question. And like honestly, yes, that's always a concern, right? With psych studies, right? Because you can never really record people. Like you can't ever really do a study without letting them know they're in a study. Um, and so like you sort of just like that's something you have to accept is that that degree of naturalisticness cannot really be achieved. But you can take measures, right, to make it feel as naturalistic as possible for the like the caregivers. And so like one of the things that we did is like the toys that we used, we didn't just use any toys. We used the ones that like in that area are like commonplace, just to like enforce the sense of it like being, this is just like what I do at home with my child. And then I think what was the first question you asked?
Why did you choose those two countries?
Oh, okay. So my lab specifically, so remember I said that the grant was like it covered many different countries. Um, my lab was in charge of the data from these like this region, and so that's why we had these two countries specifically. The reason why we didn't like do something, I want to say, let's say we could do a within country analysis, right? Uh, this data set, like when the grant was written, it wasn't necessarily that we knew what they knew what they were going to do with the analysis. And so like these another way that these two countries differ is like their main spoken language. So for Malawi, I think it's Chichewa, and then for South Africa, it's Xhosa. And so those are two different languages. They're actually very different. So Xhosa has clicks and Chichewa doesn't. And so like if you wanted to do some sort of language comparison analysis, like these are two good countries to collect data from, and like the data from these two countries is a good comparison to make. And so I wish I could say that like I know exactly why they chose these particular countries in Africa to compare, but I sus like what I suspect is that like it's just because like this is the region that we got in the grant. Although I do know that people want to like uh replicate this analysis with the data from other countries. Um, oh, but I will say like we really wanted to have this region because most of the work has been done in like Western nations. And so we wanted to see like what is like we wanted to have a study that actually isn't making assumptions that, oh yeah, like the way they do it in the West is the way they do it everywhere. And so we were like presenting this population as like sort of a norm, as in like, yeah, we're going to use this as like our base understanding of how this relationship works between like caregiver behavior and infant attention.
Oh,
Does
got
that
it.
kind of
So there are already some other studies, like similar studies within different regions. So it was more like to build a comparative.
Yeah, a little,
Cool.
yes, a little bit. The other studies weren't necessarily as naturalistic, so they might have involved coming into the lab and playing with specific toys.
Mhm.
Or they might have maybe like recorded only like one angle, etc. But like you're right in that like this isn't like a completely novel thing. So like the coding categories that you see are actually from another study that did like a similar analysis of caregiver behavior. And so we chose those categories because we knew from that paper that these were very productive categories to study that show up in caregiver interactions.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, so I think like the major question you might have after seeing these videos is like, okay, so this is like great. Like we have these like categories of like pointing and like vocalizing and infant looking, but like how do you quantitatively analyze that? And so the answer to this again is actually it wasn't something we came up with. This is already like something that had been repeated in psych literature. Uh, what we wanted to do was we quantified caregiver behavior by measuring the unpredictability of that behavior. And so when we say unpredictability, what we're talking about is, well, I'm gonna give you what the actual measure is in the next slide. But the way you approach a quantify like I want to say some sort of a metric, right? A quantity. The way you get to a quantity from a bunch of video frames is first you have an intermediate step where you take all your annotations and you basically represent the caregiver's like time series of behaviors as a sequence of behavioral states. And so if you look, let me see. Okay, there we go. So if you look at this like middle figure here, this like timeline, you can imagine this is when the video first starts and this is when the video ends. And each of these colors is like caregiver were vocalizing in this interval and the baby was looking in this interval. You can imagine all of the states that the caregiver can possibly do in other colors on this line, right? And so then what you'll have is like regions that are different colors, and sometimes the colors are compounds of multiple states. And so you basically classify each of those regions of different colors as a different behavioral state that is characterized by whatever behaviors are active during that interval. So let's say the first state that we would say in this caregiver's behavioral representation is just vocalizing. And then we have a region where babies are looking. If you replace baby looking with another caregiver behavior, you get this really interesting interaction where you're going to have two caregiver behaviors overlapping right here. And so instead of saying that it's two behavioral states, we say that it's a new type of behavioral state where both behaviors are active. This is going to be important in the next slide, which we're going to go to now, unless anyone has questions. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so how do you measure unpredictability? This is a metric that already exists. I actually originally made this presentation for a psych audience, and so you might, a lot of the people here might already know what this means. So Shannon entropy is the metric that we use, and it's synonymous with, it's also like known as uncertainty. It's also known as information content, and the like term that we're going to use here is I want you to focus on is not information content, but rather uncertainty. So the thing about Shannon entropy is that it scales with uncertainty. And so we're saying that it scales with unpredictability. Okay, so what actually is Shannon entropy? So again, like if this was for a psych audience, so they might not be as familiar with it, even though this has been used in other psych studies. You basically want to take any like sequence of states. You could take any sequence of states represented as like two random variables. So each like pair of states that shows up next to each other in a sequence, you can like say like, oh, there's a transition between those two states. So you could have a random variable that describes the first state in a transition, and then a random variable that describes the second state in a transition. And now that you have these two random variables, you can calculate the probability of those each of those states being like some specific state. So like caregiver vocalization or caregiver touching infant, or even the compound state. So touching infant and vocalizing at the same time. You can compute the probability of that first state in the transition being one of those categories, compute the probability of the second state in the transition being any of those probabilities, and wherever you have a probability, you have entropy. So if you have a probability distribution, you can compute an entropy value. And so the entropy value that we compute for those transitions is actually the conditional entropy. So what is the predictability of, or how much uncertainty is there in the second state of a transition, given that you just observed the first state? So from the infant's point of view, it's basically like if I just saw my caregiver do something, if I just saw that my caregiver was in some behavioral state, how hard is it for me as a baby to predict what their next behavioral state is going to look like? So that's like the literal interpretation of it. Okay, so just like to go back to that state sequence that we had, remember like we characterize each caregiver as a sequence of behavioral states. From those sequences, those state sequences, we look at the transitions between the states. So here we have 4 states, we have 3 transitions. And we want to look at for each transition, 2 components, what is the first behavioral state and what is the second behavioral state? And then from those 2 random variables, we can compute the conditional entropy. So what is the uncertainty in the final state, given that you just observed the first state in that transition? And so what we call behavioral entropy in this presentation, in this paper, is mathematically just the entropy of y given a specific value of x. So for a given behavior, let's say caregiver vocalization, how unpredictable is the caregiver given that you just heard her vocalize, or given that you just saw her touch a baby? If you're the baby, like there is some degree of unpredictability, but you might have expectations in like what your caregiver is going to do next. Any questions here? Because I was kind of like hand wavy. Okay, no questions. Amazing. And so now I'm getting into the actual like results. We have 3 minutes left. I'm gonna kind of like go through this really, really fast. So the first thing that we wanted to know was like, first off, do the caregivers behave differently based on whether or not the environmental affordances are different? So depending on if there are toys or no toys, is the conditional entropy, their overall conditional entropy, so not specific to any behavior in the first state, literally just in general, how hard is it? Like how unpredictable are they? And what we found was that the overall conditional entropy between the 2 conditions was the same. And so what this tells us is that, yeah, like on average, like the caregivers are actually like the unpredictability in their behavior is not different between the 2 conditions. So how hard it is to predict what they're going to do next is actually approximately the same between the 2 conditions, which would make you think that, okay, so no, caregivers are not sensitive to their environmental affordances. This might be surprising if you remember that what we say by environmental affordances is literally the presence of toys, presence of no toys. And if you recall the categories we were talking about, one of the categories was holding an object. So how is it possible that like in one category, in one condition, you literally have more objects to interact with, but it doesn't seem like there's any change in the caregiver's behavior. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to break this value down further, and we wanted to look at the individual behavioral unpredictabilities. So what this means is if we look at specific behavioral states, how unpredictable is what the like mother's next behavior going to be. And so single states are just like those original categories that I talked about, where it was like vocalizing, holding object, touching baby. And then we have a selection of combination states here that we saw showed up a lot in the data, which is like times when the mom was doing both of these things at once. And so also I've been alternating between saying caregiver and mom. When we recruited people for the study, we just wanted caregivers, so like whoever is the primary caregiver. When we looked at the actual like gender identifying data, we realized that this particular 222 data points, they were all moms. And so that's why I'm saying moms, is because they ended up actually being moms. But you could like, that isn't something you should assume when you see the word caregiver in these kinds of studies. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, what we looked at here was we looked at, given that you just saw them do a specific behavioral state, how hard is it to predict their next state? And so the two conditions are going to be distinguished by like the lighter shade is going to correspond to their entropy in the no toy condition, and then the darker color is going to be their entropy in the toy condition. Okay, so what we saw here was something very, very interesting, and that is that when we looked at the entropy per behavior, and we look at it for single states, we saw some statistical significance and like statistical difference, significant difference between how much unpredictability there was in the toy versus the no toy condition. So I think a good example of this is if you look at the holding object one, which is the one which is again the behavior that I mentioned before. So in the toy condition, which is the darker orange bar, it looks like their entropy, their unpredictability following this behavioral state was actually higher, much higher than their unpredictability in the no toy condition. So this aligns a lot better with like our intuitions about the situation, which is like if there are more, like if you actually have toys that you can interact with, then the caregiver's behavior is now it's gonna involve those toys more than if there were no other objects around in the room, right? And so you see similar effects when you even look at the combination behavioral states, and they're actually like even more pronounced. So for example, vocalizing and touching baby. I think this is a really good one because if you look at the toy condition, it basically means that they are like far less predictable. They are far more predictable, or they're far less unpredictable when they're vocalizing and touching a baby in the toy condition than they are in the no toy condition. And so you can imagine that this is because in the no toy condition, they're doing a lot of activities that are like unrelated maybe to holding objects, right? And so, you know, the state space of like non-touching object actions that they can take is like way bigger and more likely to be accessed in the no toy condition than in the toy condition. In the toy condition, what was probably happening was that after vocalizing and touching the baby, they just touched an object. So does that like sort of intuitively make sense the way I've explained it so far? If you have a question, just like raise your hand. Okay, so just like going back to the previous result, it turned out that if you were to take this like equivalence and you inspect it further, you can conclude that even though the unpredictability is approximately the same between the two conditions, the composition of that entropy, of that unpredictability, differs based on the environmental affordances. So it's not that caregivers respond the same, they act the same way, regardless of their environment. They actually do modulate their behavior around their infants based on what is available to them in the environment and what they can interact with. Okay. So the other major result was we wanted to see, well, are babies picking up on this? So we know that the caregivers vary their behavior based on their affordances, right? Like we know that their unpredictability varies, but do the infants, are they sensitive to that? Do they change how often they look at their caregivers based on how unpredictable their caregivers are? And so what we looked at here was like, this is averaged across all of the infants. And so this is not within dyad, this is just across all of the pairs. We wanted to see like, if you characterize each of the caregivers as, you know, more or less unpredictable. So that's what this bottom x-axis measure is. This is literally like for each data point, how unpredictable on average was that caregiver. And then the y-axis is like the total number of I think milliseconds, I want to say, milliseconds or seconds, probably milliseconds, that the infant looked at that caregiver over the course of their toy and no toy sessions. And so the darker color is the toy condition and the lighter color is the no toy condition. You see that the slopes of both of these lines is like approximately negative, right? And so the really cool finding here is that as mothers that are more unpredictable receive on average less looking from their infants. And so the interesting thing there is like, more unpredictable means like it's more uncertain, it's more random. But yeah, sorry, say that again. Yeah. So the idea is that like this is like saying there's like like a simple linear relationship. If you're a caregiver, you don't want to be too random, or your baby's not going to find you informative, right? But you can actually break this analysis down into like within infant study, right? And you can also do this like within behaviors. So here what we're looking at is the unpredictability after vocalizing or after object holding in each of the two conditions. And so you'll see, like, again, similar to that negative slope in the previous slide, it seems like there tends to be like depending on which condition you're looking at. So let's just look at the vocalizing unpredictability. If we just look at the no toy condition, when there are no toys around, infants looking and infant sensitivity to entropy has a negative slope. So the more unpredictable their caregivers are following vocalization, the less likely their infant is to look at them. But if you go to the toy condition, this line, the slope becomes more neutral. So what that tells you is that when there are toys around, infant attention is less negatively related to their caregiver's entropy. So depending on the condition you're looking at, the relationship between infant attention and entropy is going to change for vocalizing. You see a reverse pattern in object holding unpredictability, which is on the right-hand side, for the no toy and toy condition. So in this case, when you look at the no toy case, you see that the slope is, again, like it's pretty neutral. It's not very negative, which tells us that actually it kind of doesn't matter in this condition, if there are no toys around, how unpredictable the caregivers are when they're just like after holding an object, after picking up a toy, let's say. But it does matter more in the toy condition. So in the toy condition, if caregivers are more unpredictable after picking up an object or touching an object, then the babies look at them less. Okay. And so those analyses were all, again, across infant-parent pairs, but you can also do this analysis within caregiver-infant dyads. And so what we wanted to look at in this case was for each of the caregivers and their infants, we looked at the entropy of the caregiver's behaviors in like time intervals, like time windows. So instead of looking at the entropy of the whole sequence, we did 20-second segments, and for each of those segments, we computed the same like unpredictability values that we were talking about before. And we also computed for those same segments what percentage of the time were the infants actually looking at their caregivers. And so this is where we got I think it's a kind of a crazy result. Instead of seeing like a line, instead of seeing a linear effect, we found a more quadratic effect relationship between infant attention and entropy. Specifically, what we found was that when the caregivers were too predictable or when they were too unpredictable, infant looking tends to have a downward trend. So infants don't really prefer the extremes of unpredictability. They don't want a caregiver that's too predictable and they don't want one that's too unpredictable. Instead, there's sort of this like sweet spot-ish thing in the middle here where where infants are most likely to look when they're at that like average, like sort of a favorable level of unpredictability. And so this makes sense. This made a lot of sense to us because if you think about like what entropy means, it's not just uncertainty, it's also information content. So if you're observing a truly random event, right, you can't really get a lot of information from observing a truly random event because it's just like completely random. there's no structure to it. But also, if you're observing a completely deterministic event, there's no point in observing it. You already always know what's going to happen. You don't get much information from that. And so what you really want to do is observe events that have some structure to them, but not so much structure that it's a trivial problem to predict what's going to happen next. And so that's what we see here in this like sort of quadratic shape, that infants like have this preference for entropy that's neither too predictable nor too unpredictable. And so the finding here was not just that there's this like sort of sweet spot, but it's also the fact that infant attention actually does actually trend with their own caregivers' unpredictability. So it's not that infants are just completely ignoring how unpredictable their caregivers are. When their caregivers vary in their unpredictability, depending on the context, the infant's attention will also vary. So again, the context thing was like here, you see like when there are no toys versus where there are toys, whether or not infants actually care if you're being too unpredictable or not. That's what this slide was. Okay, so I have some ongoing future work here, but I'm not going to go over that because that's beyond the scope of this. But what I wanted to conclude with was just this, like, this is like, I'm going to say this is a little study because this is just one study that we did with like, 220, a cohort of like 220 infant caregiver pairs from 2 countries. And like this gives evidence, or like it sort of supports the idea, but it can't really confirm it because again, it's just one study, that babies, like, they don't just look at like whatever. They don't just look at like whatever's most random or like whatever's easiest to look at. They actually look at something that's at some like optimal level of unpredictability, and that what that optimum is and what their like preference for more or less unpredictable is will differ based on what context they're in. So what the environmental affordances are of their environment. And so like babies are not just like looking randomly, and they're not looking the same way regardless of their context. They're looking in a very educated, well, I say educated, but like they're not like they're babies. They're looking in a very informed way, I want to say. And they're looking in a way that's like, again, not necessarily conscious because, these are 3-month-old infants, but their brains have somehow like optimized to extract information in a very guided way. And so if you're a roboticist, one thing that you might want to do is figure out like, what do babies look at 3 months? What do they look at 6 months? What do they look at 12 months? Get all of that data and maybe figure out like and make inferences about what features are attracting their attention at each of those stages. And then when you want to train your artificial agent, what you could do is do some sort of training like I forget what the word is. It's like a regime, not a regime, curriculum. Thank you. Thank you to the audience. Curriculum, some training curriculum where you start out with looking patterns based on the 3-month-olds, and then you do looking patterns based on the 6-month-olds, and you slowly build up to older children or even adults looking patterns. The idea there is that, again, in attention, like in development, is going to be different based on like how much information you have, but it's also going to be informative, and it's going to be like informative to your level of expertise in that task. Okay. That's just one idea. That's all I have. Did anyone have questions for class? I can do if anyone in Zoom has questions, I could do you first. No questions. Yes, Himali, go ahead.
Previous slide. To condition on whether like previous state is localizing or building object.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go on to why that changes things?
Why conditioning it on the first state?
So why is the relation between entropy and how long they look different conditioned on these 2 states?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this is a bit of a complicated slide. So the question was like, why does like the relationship between entropy and attention differ based on like what behavior you're conditioning the first state on? And also it differs on the condition, right? Yeah.
States.
The more the states, right? So
But yeah.
Yeah. So basically like what Himali's pointing out is that in the case of vocalizing, so if you look at unpredictability after vocalizing, the no toy line is the one with a slope. a non-neutral slope. But if you look at the unpredictability after holding an object, it's actually the toy line, the toy condition line that has a slope. And so the explanation here, so like what we were inferring was that when you don't have any toys, right? Uh, object holding is not a particularly common, I want to say, or informative behavior from the infant's point of view. And so when you're holding objects in, let's say, the no toy condition, babies kind of don't care how unpredictable you are after you hold an object because it's just like they're not really caring, they don't really care about that particular state in this context because there are no toys around to hold. But when you look at their unpredictability in the toy condition, you see that now they are actually being more like strict about like whether or not they're going to pay attention to their caregiver's behavior. And that's because when there are toys around, maybe object holding is a more informative behavior. And so you actually want to pay attention and be sensitive to how unpredictable your caregiver is when they're holding objects or when there are toys around. If you look at vocalizing, you can imagine that like when there are no toys around, right? A lot of the variation in the caregiver's behavior is probably going to come from like saying things, right? Like even if they point at stuff and they like touch the baby and they hold the baby, there's probably going to be a lot of vocalizing in there as well. And so not only is a lot of vocalizing happening, but that vocalizing is probably indicative of something coming up that might interest the caregivers, you know? Like you might be like, oh, look at the train, and then you point, right? So basically like upon observing a vocalization, if there are no toys around, that has the potential to be informative. And so you don't want to be too unpredictable every time you vocalize because then the babies are just gonna not pay attention to you. Yeah. Versus if you're in the toy condition, the babies aren't really going to care how unpredictable you are after vocalizing because it's like, well, like there's toys here, right? Like the vocalizing is not going to be as informative in this case. Mhm. You said you had multiple questions?
Yeah, I had another question. I don't know if I have it anywhere. I was thinking how, like, in the toy condition,
Hmm.
like the babies have just more things to look at, and then you like account for that when you get the information.
Yeah, so I think I don't know if I included. Yeah, so great question. Yeah, we did do a control analysis for this basically. We wanted to look at like in each of the conditions, like does the count of these different behaviors change, right? Because like obviously if you do one behavior more, there's more potential for higher entropy because you're basically making the distribution bigger and bigger. Uh, and so what we found was like, first off, we did count like how frequent are each of the behaviors, each of the behavioral states in each condition, and we controlled for them when we did those analyses that you saw before. So it can't just be a matter of like, oh, well, it's just because there was less looking. So it can't simply be a matter of count, basically. Like it can't just be that, oh, it's not that they're sensitive to entropy, it's that they're sensitive to the amount of times you're doing that. Yeah, but it's a really good thing to bring up. That was like one of the first things we were like, okay, we have to make sure we control for that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I will say one more thing, which is like this quadratic fit finding, not novel. If you look up something called the Goldilocks effect, you'll find a few papers, I want to say like three, uh, where like they found a way more nice parabolic relationship between infant attention and unpredictability of not caregiver behavior, but just like what's happening in front of them. But the thing about those studies is that they were done in lab contexts. And so they were looking at like sequences of like shapes showing up in a screen or like sequences of tones, auditory tones that the infants had to listen to. And so it's less naturalistic because like, like a baby's not just like seeing shapes and colors, like they're seeing shapes and colors and sounds all at the same time and their caregivers there. And so like in a way, like the shape was nice to see because it sort of like confirms that, yeah, even if you make the study more naturalistic, you still see like sort of a similar relationship between unpredictability and the infant's attention. So yeah, so those Goldilocks papers, like Goldilocks developmental psychology, infant attention, if you like type those keywords in, you'll probably find those papers. And I think like I thought they were very interesting, and they're also like all by the same, I want to say, first author. So you could see like where they started with their study and then like how the next two studies they made it more and more complex because they wanted to get more precise in their conclusions. So like if you're an engineer, like I think that's a good example of how you start out with some very general like thing that you're trying to show. And then if you find a finding in that context, then you can move on to a more complex context. Okay, well, thank you guys for listening.